All right, it's on to Unit 9, which is Global Information Systems. Okay, so if we haven't been hiding under a rock for the last 25 years or so, we've really seen a ramp up of globalization, and the internet and e-commerce really helped facilitate that. As part of that, we built out network connectivity around the world. We started building global supply chains. And so we ended up with this very important piece of the supply chain. We have global customers, global products, global workforce. Okay? And I'm going to say something that may be a little controversial now. Okay? This is my thoughts. I studied economics. I've studied business. I've studied law. Okay? So this might irritate some of you. I'm just sharing my thoughts. Okay? My view is globalization is very important. And here's why I don't believe in the whole, it must be made in the US, buy American, America is great, whatever, okay? This is why I don't buy into that. We have global customers. So if as an organization we say, we are only going to buy American, we are only going to make things in America, we then alienate our customers elsewhere. So that's something to think about. And I know that the politicians throw that around all the time, but the reality is we are a very interconnected world, and it would be very difficult for any of us to live today if it wasn't for globalization. And I'm going to throw out an example from one of the economics books that I read when I did, but I didn't finish it, a master's program in economics. Okay? And so one of these books is called The World is Flat, A Brief History of the 21st Century. It's by Thomas Friedman, I believe. Okay? And in it, he talks about televisions as an example. Okay? Those stopped being made in the US many years ago. Okay? But let's just assume hypothetically that we continue to have televisions made here. Friedman talks about what those televisions would look like because there wasn't any innovation. So televisions back when I was a kid looked very similar across manufacturers. They didn't have a lot of new features, and no one was really thinking outside the box. So pretty much you bought a TV, you kept it forever because they lasted forever. So you didn't really buy any new TVs. But let's just say you wanted a TV with new features. You weren't going to get it. They were all very small. Very few of them had remote controls, and they could get a few channels. They were pretty simple devices. When they were made in the US, that's how they were. It wasn't until the Japanese TV started coming out that we started seeing new features. Bigger screens, remote controls, better picture quality, better sound, ability to hook up peripherals like VCRs and DVD players eventually and things like that. Okay? So if we'd hypothetically not moved TV manufacturing overseas, we'd still be using a TV that looked like something other than the 1960s. Okay? So that encouraged innovation. It encouraged competition. And quite frankly, we weren't the greatest at making TVs. Okay, there are certain areas where we have a comparative advantage. This is an economic term, but I'll bring it up. Comparative advantage. We have certain things that we are good at doing, and by doing those things in our economy, we have the potential to actually increase our GNP. Okay? So, for example, the U.S. is really great at making airplanes, building fighter jets, building very complex systems. We're great at information type roles, like designing software and designing hardware, and then having elsewhere where there's a comparative advantage elsewhere to actually manufacture these things. Sometimes it does make sense for us to manufacture things in the US, but it's a little naive of us to think that we can make everything here in the US. Okay, so globalization is very important in my view. We wouldn't have the iPhones and Android choices that we have, and the laptop choices and the screen choices and all these other technologies if we had to make them here in the US. And if we did, they'd be extremely expensive and none of us could afford them anyways. So in a way, globalization's made things cheaper for us. Okay? Now, that being said, there are some things I mentioned that we do make in the US that are, we make them and people from other countries buy them. So there are things we have a comparative advantage in producing in the US. And so if we look at things from a macroeconomic perspective, globalization is very good for us. Now, if we look at this from a microeconomic perspective of, let's say I'm Johnny and I live in Cold Springs, Nebraska, population 1,000, and we have a factory for Sony, or not Sony, Zenith, which used to be a TV maker. Okay? And Zenith moves the manufacturing of TVs to Mexico or something. Obviously, at a microeconomic level, that's bad. Okay? So those microeconomic issues are not something that we can solve perhaps at a national level, but we can do various things to try to counteract those. Manufacture other things that we have an advantage at manufacturing, other opportunities, relocation people, whatever that might be. But at a macroeconomic level, globalization is actually a very good thing for all of us. Okay, looking at the broad picture. Now, that being said, I mentioned we have global customers. If we only did American made, buy American, et cetera, we are going to piss off the customers in other countries, because we end up in a situation where a customer says, well, I'm only going to buy, I'm in France or whatever, I'm only going to buy something if it's made in France. So now as an organization, we have to start producing in France if we want to sell in France. And maybe you say, okay, France is not a big market, who cares about it? Okay, true. But what about China? If we want to sell in China, we'd have to build a factory in China and produce in China, or we may not be able to buy there or sell our products there, right? So you can see the impact of not producing in local areas. So the most ideal situation from a global perspective and from a global business perspective is to make sure we produce products in the countries that our customers care about, or make it where they don't care about that so much, because I'll produce this in this country and I'll produce this other thing in another country. Okay, and I spread it out into other areas. In the end, we end up bringing up everybody in the world's quality of living, not just our own. Okay, so as an organization, and I've spent most of my career in global organizations that sell globally, and so I have more perspective than those who only have ever worked for a U.S. company that only sells in the U.S. Every company I've worked for has always sold internationally. Okay, global products. So we want to produce products for the global marketplace, and those products can vary from place to place. We might have common products in every country. We might have products specific to specific countries. Okay? We also have a global workforce. So this allows us to manage our costs, manage our risks. And a great example of this was just thinking about from the software industry. There was a problem up in the Bay Area. And the entire company, most of the company worked at headquarters. But my team was spread across the world. And so because we had a global workforce, when there was I think it was a massive power outage or something, and nobody could work in the office, nobody could work at their homes, my team kept working because we were spread around the globe. So I'm a big proponent of having a global workforce for many reasons. And here's the other thing. All of us are now in our homes, whatever that might be, either working or going to school, or in my case, teaching. Okay? We are globally distributed. When we are able to do that, that minimizes the risks of our operations from a business perspective. So I want to hit this home that, yes, there are emotional aspects to globalization, but for the purposes of the discussion in this course, we got to remove those types of emotional conversations and think about this pragmatically from a business perspective. This is why businesses do this. And as you go into your careers and you work for organizations and you start to see why these decisions are made, they make a lot of sense. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about globalization from my own personal perspective of a company that I used to work for. Okay, actually, I'll give you two examples. So Company A is a global company, and they have employees around the globe. And we did a lot of the work like on the engineering side here in the US. And then we started building out operations in India, and actually it was just India and then Israel and here in the US. Okay? We started building out this operation in India, and it went well in the beginning. We started moving some of our roles over there. We saved some money, but here's what happened. As we moved along, a lot of other companies did the same thing. Those workers became much more expensive for us. Within about 2 years, we had a couple of problems. Number one was that the workers that we had in roles began demanding that they be made managers, because culturally, it was expected that you would become a manager after a certain number of years experience. And when we weren't able to comply and make everybody a manager, we lost a lot of good people to competitors. Second problem was compensation. We did have a huge disparity between the US and India, but within 2 years, that gap had closed significantly. So much so that we moved a lot of the positions back because it was no longer cost effective to have them in India. So we ended up moving a lot of our positions back to the US, and because the cost benefit went away, okay? Now, the second story is related to another company. This one was not as large, but we had a team in the US that was developing our software. And then someone said, well, let's build out a team in China. So we built out offices in Xi'an and Chengdu. I apologize if I didn't pronounce those correctly. And so I built out teams in both of those locations. And so I hired managers, and those managers reported to me and had individual contributors who reported to them. And so ultimately I ended up with a team of about 50 people in China and about 20 in the US, okay? And what happened was, over time, their wages went up as well, which is great, okay? That means that their quality of life went up. They were able to afford things that they could not afford. And to give you some perspective, when I first hired these individuals and they came to the US to actually do training, the managers, they couldn't afford their hotel room because the wages in China were so low. So they had to have one of us pay for the hotel room and get reimbursed for it because it was too much money. So when you and I think about going to, McDonald's or whatever and spending $5 on a meal, maybe it's not that cheap anymore. I haven't gone to McDonald's in a long time, but that's a lot of money. So that was really difficult to see. So it made me very happy to see that we're able to provide more of a living wage for those individuals because they're human beings as well. Now, what happened was, as the years progressed, their wages kept going up because, again, a lot of companies did the same thing. And it got to the point where we could no longer afford to have the two offices in China. So we consolidated down to the Xi'an office, and we effectively shut down the Chengdu office. But even that wasn't enough. We ended up having to really curtail our operations there and started moving some of those roles to other locations around the world. It's a fact of business, okay? Now, let's talk about websites now. So now let's assume we operate in a global world and we have a website and we have to think about all the different places that we operate. So here's some of the things we have to think about. Do we localize the website for each country that we operate in? An example with that would be Amazon has Amazon.com, Amazon.co.uk in the UK, and probably others, I don't know. We have to think about cultural differences in our website. And I'll use just to give you an example of cultural differences, but not from a website perspective. Think about terminology that we use and branding. Chevy famously created a car called the Nova, the Chevy Nova. My great-grandparents had one. I remember it as a kid. Ugliest green car you ever seen. But it didn't sell in Mexico. And why? Because Nova in Spanish means no go. It was a huge failure. So you want to think about cultural differences when you build your website. You don't want to do something offensive. And I've seen people build a really beautiful website. They don't think about the cultural differences. They put some sort of icon or picture or something and it offends someone. So you've got to think about that when you're building a website. Another thing is currency conversion features. So if I'm in the US, I expect my currency on a website to be in US dollars. Likewise, if someone in the UK is going in, they expect it to be in UK British pounds, okay? We have to think about currency conversion features for our website. How are we going to handle that? And then another thing is dates. This is such a simple thing, but it always screws with people because if you're from another country, you know what I mean. The dates that we use in the US are completely different than what the rest of the world uses. So when we build our website and we put dates in the wrong format, we can lead to confusion with our constituents of who's actually visiting our website. So we want to be careful that we think about how are we going to do our dates on our websites to make sure that either we do them based on language and location, and we geo encode so that it changes it based on where you're at, or we come up with some sort of standard format that's easily understood. Okay? And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, in the US we use month, day, year, but in other countries they use day, month, year. So you can see where there could be confusion in the lower number of days of the month. So if it's the 4th day of February, here in the US we'd say 2/4/20. But in other countries, you'd say 4/2/20. So that can be a huge problem. Another thing is foreign languages. And I mentioned email here. So you've got to make sure you can either read and send email in foreign languages, or you have some capability to do so if you receive a message, because chances are you receive something. I'm on some of the lists at work, and we get messages in Spanish and German and French and Chinese and all these other languages. And we have to be able to understand them. So we have to have the staff to understand those things or outsource that to a third party. Same with our website. We need to be able to localize the language for people and be able to have the option to change the language, and how we change and what languages we support. That's a decision that we have to make as an organization. Another thing is multiple forms of payment. So have lots of forms of payments available. In the US, we mostly use credit cards, maybe debit cards. Okay? Other countries, check is more common, cash is more common, micropayments are more common. So you've got to think about where you operate. And the last thing here is international logistics and custom regulations. And so I've got a really great example of this one. I bought something from a company, appeared to be US based, but it's a US subsidiary of a Chinese company, and it was a bone for my dog that moves around and stuff. And the little motor inside it died. And so I contacted their support, and the guy said, oh, absolutely no problem, and I'll send you a new one. Well, 3 months had passed, they still didn't have it. And so I emailed them, I said, hey, I never got this. And he goes, oh, it shows it was delivered. Oh, it was delivered to customs. It got lost at customs. And then he looked at it and he said, oh, it looks like we mislabeled it. And so it was held up and will never be arriving to you because it was mislabeled as the wrong item. So customs held it. So you've got to understand the customs regulations and also international logistics, because if you're shipping an item overseas, it's pretty small. It's not that difficult to ship. You're shipping something very large, it becomes a big logistics nightmare. And telling you from, I told you about the company I worked for where we had the Chinese operations. We actually had to ship physical hardware to China because we had to have it configured for all our systems. And so shipping that to China was not something that we did and overnighted it. It went by ship. So it was something we had to ship out like a month in advance to get it over there. Okay. So you've got to think about those sorts of things for your website. Another thing is global information systems. So we have to have information systems that operate across borders. And so in order to do this, we have things like a global database and information sharing technologies. With a global database, we have some design and implementation challenges that we have to think about. One of these is currency conversion. This is a huge issue in global business. How are you going to handle currency conversion so you make sure that you're reporting accurate numbers in your financials? Another thing is character sets. Okay, so we have different character sets used for different languages. We've got to think about how do we handle that. A great example of this, I worked for a company, and one of our customers was a Japanese manufacturing company, and we had a system that was an intermediary between the two mail systems. And it operated using the Japanese character set. I'm not sure what it's called, so I'll just call it the Japanese character set. And then our system operated using the Latin, which is what the English language uses, okay, character set. And we had issues because the database was not set up to escape certain character sets. So sometimes when certain characters in the Japanese side or the English side were used, we'd have problems on both sides of the database. Okay? Another thing is date, phone, postal code format differences. This is a huge one if you've ever bought anything online from a company that's not in the same country as you. Airlines are nightmares for this sort of thing. Okay? They handle the postal code in their particular countries. The American Airlines, not the company American Airlines, but the US-based airlines, I should say, they look for US postal codes. You go to, say, a UK airline, they're looking for the UK postal code, which are completely different. So you've got to figure out how do you handle this when you build your database. Same with phone numbers. They're very different worldwide. Drives people nuts when you work in a global business and someone says, what's your phone number? And you say, oh, it's 951-555-1212. And they say, is 9 the country code? You gotta think about more of a global sense when you're designing these systems. And then I already mentioned dates as an issue. So how do we share information globally? Well, we're all doing that today. We've got things like video conferencing, audio conferencing. We have distributed databases. We might have electronic data interchange if we're a business that works with suppliers. Email, networking. We have complexities in global information systems, things like legal factors. What laws do we have to comply with, that sort of thing. Cultural factors, monetary factors, and then we also have political factors that can come into play. For a global information system, the requirements are that we have certain pieces here, okay? And the first 4 fall into the operational category and the other 2 are for strategic planning. So we have to have global data access to operate. We have to have consolidated global reporting. We have to have communication. We have to be able to manage our short-term foreign exchange risk, okay, or Forex. On the strategic side, we have to be able to do strategic planning, and we have to be able to manage our global tax risk. Okay? So those of you going into finance know exactly what I'm talking about, or will when you get through your major program. These are big areas. When we implement a global information system, we have to think about the different business opportunities globally, justify our investment, ensure that we have adequate experience with a GIS system, and if needed, we have to acquire that expertise. We don't just go with one person and implement a global information system. Okay? And then proper planning. And I also wanted to make one note before we move on. GIS can have multiple meanings, just like any other acronym. In this particular situation, we're referring to global information systems, not geographical information systems. Geographical information systems are used for mapping applications. Okay, so you may encounter GIS applications in your business, and there's the geographical kind and there's the global kind, okay? 2 different concepts. If you're interested in the geographical side, I believe there's a class that's offered in the School of Business for geographical information systems. As far as organizational structures, there are 4 major types. The first is a multinational. Nestle's an example of this. We have our production, our sales and marketing. Those are decentralized at a regional level or at a business unit level. The financial decisions are centralized though. So if we're going to invest in a new plant, that decision is made at a corporate level. We can have a global-based organizational structure where we have centralized information systems, but aside from that, things are pretty distributed. That's McDonald's as an example. We can have an international business where the headquarters makes all the decisions, and that's an example of Caterpillar. And the last is transnational, where we have shared decisions that kind of flow back and forth between the boundaries. Ford is a good example of that. Now let's talk about offshore outsourcing, and this happens a lot in these key areas. So software development, manufacturing, help desk and support, and testing. So this goes back to the whole comparative advantage that I talked about earlier. There can be reasons why we outsource offshore. Now we can also outsource best shore or near shore or onshore. So let's start. Best shore is just another way of saying picking whichever one of these is the best one for the business. That's what most businesses do. Near shore is, so offshore is far offshore. So think, other side of the world. Okay. Near shore is, let's say I'm a US based company. I'm going to outsource to Mexico or Latin America. Okay. And then onshore is when we outsource to another organization within our boundaries of where our organization's based. So for example, if we're US based, it's somewhere onshore, so somewhere in the US. Maybe that means we outsource our help desk to a company in Nebraska because it's cheaper to do that there. Maybe we outsource our manufacturing to a company in Texas because it's cheaper to do that there. Maybe we outsource our testing to a company in Virginia because it's cheaper there. And then lastly, maybe we outsource our software development to engineers that are distributed across the US or something. Okay? But the key thing being those are employees of other organizations, not our own. Now, there can be challenges with this. So we can have a lack of standards. One company might have one way of doing things, one employee might have things, way of doing it that's different. And because you don't have any control over those individuals, you can't control the quality. Cultural challenges, especially if you're dealing with nearshore and offshore, you could have some cultural challenges. And so you're going to have to work through that as an organization. Okay. Regulation, so there can be challenges. You could be running your business one day with your development offshored, and suddenly whoever the president is decides to enact tariffs, and suddenly you're faced with 50% tariffs or something. So that can be a potential challenge for you. Telecommunications infrastructure. So in some areas of the world, we don't yet have reliable telecommunications infrastructure. So you have to think about where you set up your operations. Is there reliable infrastructure? I certainly wouldn't put the bank of my business on an organization that's in a country where there's one internet connection to the outside world, because if it gets shut down, you're screwed. Okay? And the last thing is insufficient skills on the team. So if you don't have sufficient skills on the team, this can be an area where you have challenges. Okay? So that's it for Chapter 9.